a black nurse, exhausted from a 12-hour hospital shift, stopped by a local grocery store to pick up some essentials. But when she reached the checkout line, everything changed. A store manager accused her of theft, humiliating her in front of other customers despite her protests and clear evidence to the contrary. Within minutes, the police were called, and what happened next set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What unfolded after shook the community, exposed systemic bias, and left an indelible mark on everyone involved. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive into the details, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you find this story as powerful as we do, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that shine a light on the truths we must confront together. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, but it became the moment everything changed. The morning light slanted through the thick glass panes of Harlem's bustling bakery, bathing the space in a golden glow that didn't quite match the mood. Eleanor Mason adjusted her coat, feeling the brisk chill of late autumn seep into her skin despite the warmth of the coffee cup she held tightly. She had been here before, countless times, yet today the familiar hum of morning chatter, the soft clatter of dishes, and the faint smell of cinnamon rolls felt different, offbeat, like a tune played out of key. Eleanor had spent her life walking a tightrope. As a middle-aged black woman who had climbed to a managerial position in a corporate world that was slow to recognize her brilliance. She knew how to hold her tongue when necessary and speak when required. She was no stranger to stares that lingered a moment too long or the subtle tightening of shoulders when she entered a room. This, after all, was America, land of opportunity, home of unsaid hierarchies. Across the room, a young white couple laughed as they shared a plate of scones. Their world untouched by Eleanor's realities. Their ease reminded her of a simpler world that had never truly existed for her. Even as a child, she watched them for a moment, a wistful smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, before the sensation of being watched brought her back to herself. A man at the counter, tall, burly, with the hard-set jaw of someone who expected compliance, was staring. His uniform bore the emblem of the local delivery service, but his eyes carried something far heavier. Eleanor returned his gaze for a beat longer than she usually would have. It wasn't defiance, it was exhaustion. She turned away, but not before catching the curl of his lip, the slight sneer that spoke volumes in its subtlety. This was the first test of the day. Eleanor stepped out onto the street, the air brisk and biting against her face. She pulled her coat tighter and started her walk to the office. The neighborhood was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of a city that rarely stopped to consider the individuals it carried along. Yet in every glance she caught, every hurried shuffle of feet as she passed, Eleanor could feel the weight of assumptions pressing down. At the corner, a street vendor called out cheerfully, offering roasted chestnuts. Eleanor smiled and shook her head, but the sound of his voice lingered, rich, warm, and free in a way she hadn't felt in months. It reminded her of her father's voice, the way he used to sing as he worked long hours at the factory. His baritone a shield against the grind of life. He'd tell her, "Keep your head up, Ellie. This world doesn't shrink you unless you let it." But she could feel the shrinking today. As Eleanor turned onto 126th Street, the landscape shifted. The charming storefronts gave way to cracked sidewalks, graffiti-covered walls, and a quiet unease that hung in the air. It was a neighborhood in transition, a euphemism for displacement, for the people who had been here long before glass condos sprouted like weeds. She passed a group of young men gathered around a stoop, their laughter echoing off the walls. For a moment, she felt an unspoken connection, shared recognition of the invisible weight they all carried. But then, one of them muttered, "There she goes, walking like she's better than us." The words stung more than they should have. Eleanor stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't turn around, she didn't respond, but her mind screamed, "I am you. Don't you see?" By the time Eleanor reached the office building, her resolve had begun to fray. The sleek glass doors opened with a mechanical whoosh, and the sterile brightness of the lobby swallowed her whole. She approached the security desk, where the guard barely looked up. He reached for her ID without a word, his indifference as heavy as judgment. She handed it over, watching his expression shift ever so slightly as he read her name. He nodded and buzzed her through. Inside the elevator, Eleanor leaned against the cold steel wall and exhaled deeply. The quiet was a relief. But only for a moment. The higher the elevator climbed, the tighter the knot in her stomach grew. The morning meeting awaited her. A room filled with colleagues who smiled too easily, who spoke with unearned authority, who saw her not as their equal but as a concession to the times. Eleanor stood straighter. Not today, she told herself. Not today. The bell dinged, and the doors opened. Eleanor stepped out, ready for whatever the next test would be. Eleanor's heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor as she walked toward the conference room, her thoughts darting like fireflies. The building buzzed with activity, the hum of phones and murmur of voices blending into an indistinct background. Yet, as she passed her coworkers, there was a familiar shift in the atmosphere. Brief pauses in conversation, glances exchanged like a secret language. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they meant. The door to the conference room was propped open, a bright rectangle of light spilling into the hallway. Eleanor paused just outside, adjusting the strap of her bag and taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The table was already crowded when she entered, a mix of suits and tailored dresses encircling it like armor. The conversation was animated, dominated by the voices of two men at the far end. Carter Jennings, the VP of Marketing, and his protégé, Alex McCall. They were deep into a discussion about quarterly projections, their confidence filling the room like smoke. Eleanor slid into a chair near the middle, offering polite nods to those who acknowledged her. As usual, her presence went largely unnoticed. She pulled her notebook from her bag, but before she could jot anything down, Carter's voice cut through the din. "Eleanor," he said, his tone sharper than necessary. "You've been quiet. What's your take?" The room turned toward her in unison, their gazes landing heavy on her shoulders. She looked up, meeting Carter's expectant stare. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't a request, it was a test. Eleanor straightened in her seat, her heart pounding. She had been preparing for this moment, rehearsing her points the night before. She laid out her thoughts carefully, highlighting gaps in the strategy and proposing solutions she knew were both innovative and actionable. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate. When she finished, the room was silent. For a moment, she thought she had broken through. Then Alex leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Interesting perspective," he said, the words dripping with condescension. "But isn't that a bit ambitious? We've got to be realistic about what we can achieve." A few chuckles rippled around the table, and Eleanor's stomach sank. Carter nodded, as if Alex had spoken some profound truth. "Good point," he said. "Let's circle back to Eleanor's idea later, once we've ironed out the basics." Later. Eleanor knew what that meant. The meeting dragged on, with Eleanor's input relegated to footnotes in a conversation dominated by louder voices. By the time it ended, her frustration simmered just beneath the surface. She gathered her things quickly, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere. In the hallway, she was intercepted by Lila Green, the office manager, a white woman with a kind face and a habit of speaking in hushed tones. Lila glanced around nervously before leaning in. "I thought what you said in there was really smart," she whispered. "Don't let them discourage you." Eleanor forced a smile. "Thanks, Lila." It was well-intentioned, but it landed wrong. The words felt like a consolation prize, an acknowledgement that Eleanor's brilliance was obvious but inconvenient. Back at her desk, Eleanor tried to refocus. Her inbox was overflowing, and the numbers on her latest report refused to align. Yet her mind kept circling back to the meeting, replaying Alex's smirk and Carter's dismissal. She hated that it still got to her, even after all these years. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her niece, Maya, a bright and opinionated college sophomore who idolized Eleanor's resilience. The message was short but powerful. "Auntie E, don't let them dull your shine." Eleanor smiled despite herself. Maya had a way of cutting through the noise, reminding her of who she was. The afternoon brought a new challenge, as Eleanor made her way to the elevator for a client meeting. She passed a group of colleagues clustered near the break room. Their conversation paused as she approached, their laughter fading into awkward silence. One of them, James, a middle manager with a penchant for passive-aggressive remarks, offered a tight smile. "Hey, Eleanor," he said, his tone overly casual. "Are you heading to the big client pitch?" "I am," she replied evenly. "Good luck," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a tough crowd. Just remember, they might not be as open to new ideas as we are. The implication hung in the air. Unspoken but undeniable. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Then she turned and walked away. The client meeting was uneventful, but Eleanor's mood didn't lift. By the time she returned to her desk, the office was beginning to empty. She stayed behind, the quiet offering a strange solace. She worked late into the evening, her focus sharpening with each passing hour. When she finally packed up to leave, the office was dark and still. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. Her shoulders were squared, her expression resolute. Eleanor Mason had spent a lifetime navigating these spaces, pushing against the subtle barriers that sought to contain her. She would push again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, because some battles, she knew, were fought not in a single moment, but in the relentless act of showing up. The morning began like any other. Eleanor stepped off the train into the busy downtown station, the rush hour crowd moving like a river around her. She clutched her coffee and laptop bag, her thoughts already consumed by the day ahead. Deadlines loomed, meetings piled up, and the subtle weight of being twice as good rested on her shoulders as always. The office lobby was bustling with energy. Colleagues greeted one another with half smiles and nods, their chatter bouncing off the polished marble walls. Eleanor nodded back as she entered, noticing how the conversation seemed to pause when her presence disrupted their rhythm. At the security desk, the guard, a wiry man in his late 50s with a permanent scowl, eyed her ID badge a little too long. It wasn't the first time. But today, Eleanor's patience was thin. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her tone even. The guard shrugged, his eyes darting to the badge again. "Just making sure," he muttered before waving her through. It wasn't overt, but it stung all the same. The implication was clear. Eleanor didn't quite fit in this world of glass towers and tailored suits. The first meeting of the day was with a new client, a small tech startup hoping to scale. Eleanor had spent weeks crafting the perfect pitch, weaving in innovative ideas that aligned with their vision. She entered the conference room prepared, her confidence like a shield. But from the moment the client arrived, the tone of the meeting shifted. The CEO, a young man in a sleek blazer, barely looked at her as she spoke, his gaze fixed instead on her male colleague, Aaron. The dynamic was unspoken but palpable. Eleanor's ideas were met with nods, but it was Aaron's echo of her points that drew the CEO's enthusiastic approval. As the meeting ended, the CEO shook Aaron's hand, ignoring Eleanor entirely. She stood there, her outstretched hand hovering for a moment before she pulled it back. Aaron glanced at her apologetically, but the damage was done. At lunch, Eleanor sought solace in the quiet corner of a nearby cafe. She had just opened her book when a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mind if I join you?" It was Lila, the office manager. Eleanor nodded, gesturing to the seat across from her. Lila placed her tray down, her expression cautious. "You were brilliant in that meeting this morning," Lila said after a moment. "But I saw how he treated you. It wasn't right." Eleanor looked up, startled. She hadn't expected anyone to notice, much less say something. "It happens," Eleanor replied, her voice tight. "I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be," Lila said firmly. Eleanor wanted to believe her, but the words felt hollow. Experience had taught her that acknowledgement rarely led to change. Back at the office, the day unraveled further. An email chain revealed that a decision Eleanor had spearheaded was being credited entirely to Aaron. She stared at the screen, her frustration boiling over. For a moment, she considered calling him out publicly. But she knew the risks. Being labeled difficult or angry could undo years of carefully built professional credibility. Instead, she drafted a pointed but measured response, attaching her original proposal for good measure. By the time she hit send, her hands were trembling. She hated this game, this delicate balance between assertiveness and restraint, between standing up for herself and avoiding the traps set by others' perceptions. That evening, as she walked to her car, Eleanor noticed a group of coworkers gathered in the parking lot. Their laughter carried across the crisp autumn air. She recognized some of them, people she worked with every day, though they rarely invited her into their circle. "Eleanor," someone called, waving her over. It was Megan, a bubbly project manager who always seemed to be at the center of office gatherings. Eleanor hesitated but forced a smile and approached. As she drew closer, she caught snippets of their conversation. Jokes that danced on the edge of discomfort. Words that felt like veiled jabs cloaked in humor. "You should come to trivia night next week," Megan said brightly, her smile too wide. "We could use someone with your perspective." The group chuckled, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist. She wanted to believe Megan meant well, but the word perspective lingered in the air, heavy with implication. She was being typecast, her identity reduced to a novelty. "I'll think about it," Eleanor said, her voice neutral. As she drove home, the events of the day played on a loop in her mind. The microaggressions, the stolen credit, the weight of 1,000 tiny slights. They stacked on top of each other, forming an invisible barrier between her and the world she worked so hard to thrive in. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper. She wanted to write something, to put words to the frustration simmering inside her. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine and opened her laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim room as she began typing. She wasn't sure who she was writing to. Maybe herself, maybe the world, but the words came fast and sharp. "Every day, I walk into spaces that tell me I don't belong. Spaces that take my brilliance and call it someone else's. Spaces that smile at me while locking the doors behind their backs. I am tired, but I am not done." As she wrote, the tension in her chest began to loosen. She wasn't sure what she would do with these words. But for the first time all day, she felt a flicker of power. Eleanor knew the fight wasn't over. It wasn't even close. But the act of naming the injustice, of refusing to let it go unspoken, was its own quiet rebellion. The morning light crept through Eleanor's curtains, painting her bedroom in muted gold. She sat at the edge of her bed, scrolling through her phone, her coffee growing cold on the nightstand. The email she had sent yesterday, highlighting her role in the proposal Aaron had co-opted, had sparked responses overnight. They were polite but evasive, carefully crafted to acknowledge her contribution without disrupting the fragile ecosystem of unspoken hierarchies. Her thumb hovered over a response, one from a senior partner who had CC'd Aaron in an attempt to mediate. The email praised Aaron's collaborative spirit, while vaguely commending Eleanor for her valuable insights. It was a non-answer, a hollow pat on the back that stung more than outright dismissal. Eleanor closed the email without replying. She had learned long ago that fighting for recognition wasn't just about justice. It was about picking battles that wouldn't cost her more than they were worth. But this wasn't a battle she could easily walk away from. The shadows of exclusion were creeping into her work, threatening to undermine her in ways she couldn't ignore. Later that morning, Eleanor entered the conference room for a departmental meeting. The atmosphere was charged, not with excitement, but with an edge of tension that crackled under the surface. The topic of discussion was the firm's upcoming diversity initiative, a public relations push in response to growing scrutiny from clients and the media. The managing director, a silver-haired man with a booming voice, stood at the head of the table. He was flanked by two junior associates who had been tasked with presenting the plan. "Our clients want to see that we're committed to inclusivity," he began, his tone authoritative but devoid of genuine conviction. "This initiative will showcase our leadership in this space. Let's ensure we deliver something impactful." Eleanor listened carefully as the junior associates outlined their ideas, none of which addressed the systemic issues she knew were at the heart of the company's challenges. The presentation was polished but superficial, focusing on optics rather than substance. When the floor opened for discussion, Eleanor hesitated before raising her hand. Her voice was steady but firm as she said, "I think this is a good start. But we're missing an opportunity to address the deeper issues. A program like this won't resonate unless we acknowledge and confront the barriers that exist within our own walls." The room fell silent. Some colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding her gaze. The managing director's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his tone carefully measured. Eleanor took a breath. "I'm suggesting we look inward. That we gather data on hiring practices, promotions, and retention rates. If we want to claim leadership in diversity, we need to back it up with action, not just messaging." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The managing director nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Thank you for your input, Eleanor. We'll take that under advisement." As the meeting ended, Eleanor gathered her things, her heart pounding. She knew her suggestion had made waves. But whether those waves would lead to progress or backlash remained to be seen. In the hallway, she ran into Aaron, who fell into step beside her. "That was bold," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Bold or reckless?" Eleanor asked, half joking. "Maybe both," Aaron replied with a wry smile. "But you made a good point. Let's see if they actually listen." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the small gesture of solidarity. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her words would be dissected behind closed doors. Her fear was confirmed when she overheard two colleagues whispering in the break room later that afternoon. "She's always pushing her agenda," one of them said, his tone dismissive. "What did she expect?" the other replied. "You can't just call people out like that and expect them to roll over." Eleanor left before they noticed her, their words replaying in her mind like a taunt. That evening, as she walked to her car, the weight of the day pressed on her shoulders. The parking lot was nearly empty, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. She unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, exhaling a long, shaky breath. Her phone buzzed on the console. It was a text from her younger brother. "Malcolm, hey, I saw this and thought of you. Keep your head up." Attached was a link to an article about a prominent black CEO who had recently resigned, citing exhaustion from fighting the invisible barriers within his industry. Eleanor read the article in her car, the CEO's words resonating deeply. "It's not the overt racism that wears you down," he had said. "It's the quiet battles, the ones you fight every day just to be seen, just to exist as yourself in spaces that were never designed for you." Eleanor closed the article and stared out at the fading light. She wasn't alone in this fight. But that knowledge didn't make the struggle any less isolating. She thought about the other women in her firm, the ones who stayed silent during meetings, who avoided eye contact when the topic of diversity came up. Were they protecting themselves, or were they simply too tired to keep fighting? By the time she arrived home, the city was cloaked in darkness. Eleanor dropped her bag by the door and sat at her kitchen table, her laptop waiting for her. She opened a new document and began typing again, her words sharper than they had been the night before. "Every time I speak, I'm reminded of the cost of honesty, the cost of existence, the cost of being black in spaces that demand assimilation while punishing difference. And yet, silence is the greater cost. To be silent is to disappear, to fade into the margins where they want us to stay." Eleanor paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. The words felt raw, unpolished, but they were hers. She saved the document and closed her laptop, her resolve solidifying like stone. She wasn't done speaking. Not yet. The rain fell in unrelenting sheets the next morning, blanketing the city in a cold, damp haze. Eleanor adjusted her coat and hurried into the office, her mind already racing with the day's challenges. She had spent half the night revising her notes for the diversity task force meeting, determined to push for concrete action despite the resistance she had felt in the last meeting. When she stepped off the elevator, the atmosphere in the office was unusually tense. People moved quickly through the halls, their faces drawn and serious. Eleanor caught snippets of hushed conversations but couldn't piece them together until she reached her desk and opened her email. The subject line stopped her cold, resignation of managing director. She clicked the message, scanning the brief note from the executive team. The managing director, the man who had so pointedly dismissed her suggestions in the last meeting, was stepping down effective immediately. The email cited personal reasons. But Eleanor knew better. There were whispers of a brewing scandal, rumors of discriminatory comments he had made during a private dinner that had somehow reached the ears of an influential client. The firm was in damage control mode, and Eleanor knew what that meant. A scramble to save face without addressing the deeper issues. The diversity task force meeting that afternoon felt like a theater production hastily thrown together to appease the audience. A junior HR representative had been assigned to lead, her inexperience evident in the way she stumbled through the agenda. Eleanor sat quietly at first, watching the group circle around the issues without ever confronting them. When the discussion turned to the firm's recruitment efforts, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Why aren't we talking about retention?" she asked, her voice cutting through the room's careful politeness. "It's not enough to bring in diverse talent if we're not creating an environment where they can thrive. Look at our turnover rates. People aren't leaving because they don't fit. They're leaving because we're not supporting them. The room fell silent. The HR representative looked flustered, her pen frozen over her notebook. A senior partner sitting across from Eleanor cleared his throat. That's a valid concern, he said, his tone carefully measured. But we need to focus on what's actionable right now. Retention is complex. Eleanor leaned forward, her frustration boiling over. It's only complex because we refuse to confront the real problems. People are leaving because they feel invisible, because they're excluded from opportunities and silenced when they try to speak up. If we don't fix that, no amount of recruitment is going to change anything. The senior partner's expression tightened. We appreciate your passion, Eleanor, but this isn't the time for grandstanding. We need solutions, not criticisms. Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. I'm offering solutions. You just don't want to hear them. By the time the meeting ended, Eleanor felt drained. She returned to her desk, her mind buzzing with the familiar sting of rejection. It wasn't just the dismissal of her ideas. It was the way they had been dismissed, as though her perspective was an affront to the carefully constructed norms of the firm. As she packed up to leave for the day, her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague in another department. Just saw the recap of your meeting. Bold move. Be careful. Eleanor stared at the message, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. Even those who supported her were warning her to tread lightly, to temper her voice for the sake of survival. But survival had never been enough for her. That evening, Eleanor found herself at a small cafe downtown, meeting with Malcolm, her younger brother. He had always been her confidant, the one person who could untangle the knots of frustration and doubt that often plagued her. You're fighting a good fight, he said, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. But you've got to take care of yourself, too. They'll burn you out if you're not careful. Eleanor sighed, staring out the rain-slicked window. I just don't know how to stop without feeling like I've given up. Like I've let them win. Malcolm nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's not about letting them win. It's about pacing yourself for the long game. Change doesn't happen overnight. You've got to find a way to keep going without losing yourself in the process. The next day, Eleanor returned to the office with renewed determination. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for the firm to catch up to her vision of equity. If they wouldn't listen, she would find other ways to push the needle. She began meeting quietly with colleagues who shared her frustrations, forming a loose coalition of allies within the company. They shared stories, strategies, and ideas, creating a grassroots effort to demand change from the bottom up. But as their efforts gained momentum, the resistance from above intensified. Eleanor's manager began scrutinizing her work more closely, nitpicking details that had never been an issue before. Her requests for additional resources were met with bureaucratic delays, and she started noticing a subtle but deliberate exclusion from key meetings. One afternoon, she overheard two senior partners discussing her in the break room. She's a problem, one of them said. She doesn't know when to let things go. She's ambitious, the other replied. But ambition only gets you so far if you don't play the game. Eleanor knew she was walking a fine line, but she couldn't shake the conviction that she was doing the right thing. The quiet battles were piling up, each one chipping away at her resolve, but she refused to let them silence her. As she sat at her desk that evening, long after most of her colleagues had gone home, Eleanor opened her laptop and began drafting a memo to the executive team. She outlined the stories she had collected from her colleagues, the data she had gathered on retention and promotion disparities, and the specific changes the firm needed to make. It was a bold move, one that could either force the firm to take her seriously or mark her as a permanent outsider. But as Eleanor typed the final sentence, she felt a quiet sense of clarity. If we don't confront these issues now, she wrote, we're not just failing our employees, we're failing ourselves. She hit save, her resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Eleanor's memo was met with an icy silence from the executive team. Days passed without a single response, and the tension at the office grew heavier with each passing hour. She caught whispers as she walked through the corridors, her name spoken in hushed tones, followed by hurried glances in her direction. By the end of the week, she received an email. Meeting request, executive review of diversity concerns. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday morning, with a list of attendees that read like a who's who of the company's power brokers. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she read the names. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a reckoning. The weekend was a blur of preparation. Eleanor pored over her notes, refining her arguments and organizing her evidence into a presentation. Malcolm stopped by her apartment on Sunday afternoon, sensing the weight of her anxiety. "They're going to try to discredit you," he warned, leaning against her kitchen counter. "You know that, right?" Eleanor nodded, her fingers drumming against her coffee mug. "I know, but if I don't go in there prepared, they'll tear me apart." Malcolm studied her, his expression serious. "Just remember, whatever happens in that room, you're more than their opinions of you. Don't let them make you question that." Monday morning arrived, gray and overcast, the weather mirroring Eleanor's mood. As she stepped into the sleek glass-walled conference room, the air felt charged with unspoken tension. The executives were already seated, their expressions neutral but guarded. The managing director, now acting in an interim capacity, opened the meeting with perfunctory remarks. "Thank you for joining us, Eleanor. We've all had a chance to review your memo, and we'd like to hear more about your concerns." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, meeting each person's gaze as she began. She spoke with clarity and conviction, outlining the disparities she had uncovered and the patterns of exclusion that had emerged from her colleagues' stories. Her voice remained steady, even as she felt the weight of their skepticism pressing down on her. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then one of the senior partners spoke, his tone measured but dismissive. "These are serious allegations, Eleanor, but without concrete evidence, it's difficult to take action on anecdotal claims." Eleanor's chest tightened. "These aren't just anecdotes, they're lived experiences, and the data supports them. Retention rates among employees of color are significantly lower than the firm average. And promotion disparities are well documented." The managing director interjected, "We're not denying there are areas for improvement, but your tone suggests a lack of trust in leadership. That's a serious accusation to make." Eleanor's frustration bubbled to the surface. Trust has to be earned. And right now, leadership isn't doing enough to earn it. Ignoring these issues doesn't make them go away. It makes them worse. The room erupted into a flurry of voices, some defensive, others placating. Eleanor held her ground, refusing to let the conversation spiral into deflection. But she could feel the undercurrents of resistance growing stronger. After the meeting, Eleanor returned to her desk, her mind racing. She had anticipated pushback, but the sheer intensity of the resistance had shaken her. The email she received later that afternoon confirmed her fears. Subject: Follow-up, diversity review meeting. Message: Thank you for sharing your perspective. While we value your passion and commitment, we believe these matters require a more balanced approach. Moving forward, we ask that you focus on your immediate responsibilities while we address these issues through appropriate channels. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. Sit down. Stay quiet. Let us handle it. Eleanor stared at the screen, a knot forming in her stomach. She had expected resistance, but this felt like a warning, a line drawn in the sand. If she crossed it, the consequences would be hers alone to bear. Over the next few weeks, the subtle retaliation began. Eleanor's workload increased dramatically, with tight deadlines that left little room for her advocacy efforts. Meetings she had once been included in were suddenly rescheduled without her knowledge. And her manager's feedback became increasingly critical, nitpicking details that had never been an issue before. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, she found an anonymous note slipped into her bag. "Be careful. They're watching." The message sent a chill down her spine, but it also stoked the fire of her resolve. If they were trying to intimidate her, it meant she was making an impact. Eleanor began meeting with her allies in secret, careful to avoid drawing attention to their efforts. They devised a plan to gather more evidence, creating a secure channel for employees to share their experiences anonymously. The stories poured in, accounts of microaggressions, discriminatory comments, and systemic barriers to advancement. Each submission added to the growing case against the firm's leadership. But the resistance wasn't just coming from above. Some of Eleanor's colleagues began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with her efforts. "You're making waves," one of them told her. "People are starting to talk." Eleanor felt the isolation acutely, but she refused to let it deter her. Change was never comfortable, and she had no intention of backing down. The tipping point came during a company-wide town hall. The interim managing director had planned to unveil a new diversity initiative. A watered-down version of Eleanor's proposals that focused more on optics than substance. As he spoke, Eleanor felt her frustration building. The initiative was a performative gesture, designed to placate critics without addressing the root causes of the firm's issues. When the floor opened for questions, Eleanor stood. With all due respect, she began, her voice steady but firm. This initiative feels like a band-aid on a much deeper wound. What's being done to address the systemic barriers that are driving employees away? The room fell silent, all eyes on the managing director. He cleared his throat, his expression tight. As I said, we're committed to creating an inclusive environment. But change takes time, and we need to be mindful of the bigger picture. Eleanor didn't waver. The bigger picture is that our employees are telling us they feel unheard and unsupported. If we don't listen to them, we'll lose them, and we'll lose the trust of our clients, too. The tension in the room was palpable. But Eleanor stood her ground. For the first time, she felt the tide began to shift. Her colleagues, many of whom had remained silent out of fear, began nodding in agreement, their expressions emboldened by her courage. As the town hall ended, several employees approached Eleanor, their voices hushed but resolute. "You're right," one of them said. "We've been quiet for too long." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. The road ahead would be difficult, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, she felt the strength of a growing movement behind her. The days following the town hall were both electric and uneasy. Eleanor had felt a spark in the room, a collective murmur of resistance that hadn't existed before. But the cost of her outspokenness became immediately apparent. The lines of power, already drawn in faint chalk, were now etched in stone. Every interaction was heavy with an unspoken message: "We're watching." It began subtly, as these things often do. Eleanor's inbox was flooded with requests for reports and metrics she wasn't typically responsible for. Her manager, a man who had once been aloof but genial, started holding check-ins that felt more like interrogations. "We're just making sure you're staying focused on your deliverables," he said with a tight smile during one such meeting. Eleanor didn't bother to argue, she knew these tactics well. The goal was to drown her in work, isolate her, and chip away at her confidence until she either stepped back or broke. When she mentioned it to Malcolm over coffee that weekend, he leaned back with a weary sigh. "They're trying to wear you down," he said. "Classic strategy. If they can't silence you outright, they'll make speaking up so exhausting that you'll give up on your own." Eleanor stirred her drink absently. "I won't give them the satisfaction," she murmured, though the weight of exhaustion was evident in her voice. Malcolm tilted his head. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let them take all of you. You're allowed to rest. You know, the fight will still be here when you're ready." Monday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind, as if the city itself were bracing for what lay ahead. Eleanor was met with an unexpected sight as she entered the office. A poster board in the lobby announcing the company's new employee wellness initiative. The phrase felt like a cruel joke, especially as Eleanor scanned the list of initiatives: yoga sessions, lunch discounts, and a hotline for anonymous feedback. Her skepticism was confirmed when she spotted the executive responsible for diversity and inclusion giving a polished interview in front of the poster. Eleanor paused long enough to catch a snippet of his speech. "At the firm, we pride ourselves on fostering an environment where every voice is heard." The bitterness in her laugh startled a passing colleague, who looked at her nervously but said nothing. The growing tension came to a head during a high-stakes client presentation. Eleanor had worked tirelessly with her team to prepare the materials, ensuring every detail was perfect. But when it came time to present, her manager made a last-minute decision to have someone else take the lead. "I just think it'll be more appropriate," he said with a shrug when Eleanor questioned him. The vagueness of his reasoning did little to mask the underlying message. Eleanor's rising profile, and the controversy surrounding it, had made her a liability. Sitting silently at the back of the room as her colleague presented her work, Eleanor felt a familiar burn of humiliation creep into her chest. The client's polite but disengaged responses only deepened the sting. She could see it so clearly. Her manager's attempt to preserve appearances had cost them credibility. That evening, she found herself in Malcolm's living room, venting her frustrations as he poured them both a drink. It's like they're afraid to let me succeed," she said, pacing. "I'm a threat now. Not because I'm wrong, but because I've made them look at the truth. And the truth is ugly." Malcolm handed her a glass, his expression serious. "The truth always is," he said, "but you've got them on the defensive. Eleanor, that means they know they're losing ground." The firm's defensive posture soon turned into a counter-offensive. A memo circulated internally, cautioning employees against disruptive behavior and undermining company morale. Though no names were mentioned, the memo might as well have been addressed directly to Eleanor. It was accompanied by whispers of discontent from some of her peers, who resented the increased scrutiny the firm was now under. "You're making it harder for everyone else," one colleague muttered to her in the break room. "Some of us just want to do our jobs without all this drama." Eleanor's chest tightened, but she didn't respond. What was there to say? She had seen it too many times, the way systems of oppression pitted people against each other, turning potential allies into adversaries. The final blow of the week came in the form of an email from the managing director himself. It was brief but pointed. Eleanor was being reassigned to a less visible role, ostensibly to give her space to refocus on her work. The new assignment was a clear demotion, stripping her of responsibilities she had spent years building. Eleanor sat staring at the screen, her fists clenched. For a moment, she considered walking away, resigning on the spot and leaving the fight behind. But then she thought of the people who had come to her, quietly sharing their own stories of exclusion and bias. She thought of the anonymous note that had warned her, and the weight of her own conscience pressed firmly against the idea of retreat. That weekend, Eleanor met with her growing network of allies. They gathered in the back room of a community center, their voices low but resolute. Among them were employees who had stayed silent during the town hall but now felt emboldened to act. They shared stories, strategies, and a determination to escalate their fight. "We can't let them push Eleanor out," Malcolm said, addressing the group. "That's exactly what they want. But if we stand together, they won't be able to ignore us." Eleanor looked around the room, her heart swelling with both gratitude and resolve. These people weren't just colleagues. They were a community, and together, they would not back down. As the meeting ended, Eleanor lingered, her mind racing with plans for the weeks ahead. She knew the battles would only grow more intense. But she also knew this: she wasn't fighting alone anymore. And that made all the difference. Eleanor stood at the threshold of the auditorium, her heartbeat thrumming in her ears. The room ahead was vast, filled with rows of folding chairs occupied by employees, executives, and members of the community. The meeting had been called to address the company's commitment to equity. But Eleanor knew it was little more than a public relations performance. This, however, was her moment, a chance to speak, to cut through the pretense, and force everyone to confront the truth they'd been avoiding. The weeks leading up to this day had been a test of her endurance. After her reassignment, Eleanor found herself inundated with minor tasks that were clearly meant to keep her occupied and out of sight. But she had refused to fade quietly into the background. Instead, she spent her nights compiling evidence, connecting with allies, and preparing for the inevitable clash. Malcolm had been a constant presence, offering advice and encouragement. "This fight isn't just yours," he reminded her during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "It's ours, and it's worth every ounce of the struggle." Still, the strain was undeniable. Colleagues avoided her in the halls. Her manager's condescending emails piled up, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Yet for every door closed, another one opened. Anonymous notes appeared in her locker and inbox, thanking her for speaking out. Former employees reached out, sharing their own stories of injustice. A quiet but growing wave of solidarity began to take shape. On the day of the meeting, Eleanor arrived early. The air was thick with anticipation, and the tension was palpable. The company's CEO, a man who had mastered the art of delivering empty platitudes, opened the session with a speech about shared values and moving forward together. His words were met with polite applause. But Eleanor noticed the shifting glances among the employees in attendance. When it came time for questions, Eleanor stood. Her presence commanded attention, and the murmurs in the room stilled. "I have a question," she began, her voice steady but firm. "What concrete actions is this company taking to address the systemic biases that so many of us have experienced firsthand?" The CEO's smile faltered slightly. Thank you for your question, Eleanor, he said, his tone practiced. As I mentioned, we're committed to fostering an inclusive environment, and our new initiatives reflect that. Eleanor didn't let him off the hook. With respect, I'm asking about accountability, not initiatives. What's being done to ensure that the policies and practices contributing to these biases are dismantled? A hush fell over the room. Eleanor could feel the weight of every gaze, the silent encouragement from her supporters, and the wary calculation of her detractors. The CEO's response was a blur of corporate jargon, but Eleanor had already made her point. She had planted a seed of doubt, a challenge to the narrative the company was trying to craft. As the meeting ended, Eleanor was approached by several employees, some hesitant, others emboldened. One woman, a junior analyst, whispered, "Thank you for saying what so many of us were afraid to say. You're not alone." But the backlash came swiftly. Within hours, Eleanor's manager called her into his office. His tone was icy as he accused her of being disruptive and warned her about the consequences of undermining leadership. "This isn't about undermining anyone," Eleanor countered, her voice unwavering. "It's about making sure everyone here is treated with respect and dignity." Her defiance only deepened the chasm between her and the company's leadership. That evening, Eleanor found herself sitting in her car, staring at the dashboard as the weight of the day pressed down on her. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not out of defeat, but out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning, Eleanor arrived to find an email waiting in her inbox. It was from an independent journalist who had heard about the meeting and wanted to interview her. "Your story could inspire others to come forward." The email read, "Would you be willing to share it?" Eleanor hesitated. She knew the risks of going public: further isolation, potential retaliation, the loss of her career. But she also knew the power of truth, the importance of being heard. Later that evening, she sat across from Malcolm at their favorite diner. The email opened on her phone. "What if I'm not ready for this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Malcolm reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You're already doing it," he said. "You've been doing it from the moment you refused to stay silent. This is just the next step." The interview aired a week later, and the impact was immediate. Eleanor's words resonated far beyond the walls of her company, sparking a broader conversation about workplace discrimination and the invisible barriers so many face. Messages poured in, some supportive, others hateful, but the overwhelming response was one of gratitude. Eleanor had become a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who felt silenced. But the fight was far from over. As the company scrambled to contain the fallout, Eleanor and her allies continued to push for systemic change. They held workshops, organized protests, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the momentum they had built would not fade. Months later, Eleanor stood before a packed auditorium, this time as the keynote speaker at a conference on equity and inclusion. As she looked out at the audience, an eclectic mix of activists, workers, and leaders, she felt a surge of both pride and humility. "I'm not here to tell you this fight is easy," she began, her voice steady. "It's not, but it is necessary. Every step we take, every truth we speak, brings us closer to a world where dignity isn't conditional, and justice isn't optional. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from the courage to be heard." The applause was thunderous, but Eleanor's focus was on the faces before her. Faces filled with determination, hope, and the promise of a better future. She had chosen to speak, and in doing so, she had sparked a fire that no force could extinguish.